Good evening et bonsoir. Thank you for joining us on this crisp winter night. My name is Catherine Spencer-Roth, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa and chair of its lecture series committee. Tonight, we will be enlightened about one of Canada's mysterious national treasures, follies perhaps, presented by Professor Peter Coffman, who many of you will have met previously through our lecture series. Before Peter applies logic to a perceived eccentricity, I'd like to acknowledge that Ottawa is at the heart of a vast homeland whose history reaches back long before the development of the National Capital Region as we now know it. For hundreds of years, Algonquin Anishinaabe people have been pressing for their Indigenous rights to be respected and their history to be understood. Heritage Ottawa makes efforts through our programs and partnerships to bring awareness to Algonquin history and heritage with events and programming. Our free lectures are made possible with the support of Sandy Smallwood and Andrex Holdings. I'm also delighted to announce a new lecture sponsor, Merkley Supply Limited. Welcome to the Heritage Ottawa family. We are also grateful for grants from the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario. I'd also like to thank those of you who are members and those who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa and encourage this very concrete form of support. Please visit our website at heritageottawa.org for details. Finally, Heritage Ottawa is recruiting a volunteer treasurer. If you or someone you know has the skills and knowledge for this role, please see our website for further information. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Peter Coffman is an architectural historian and associate professor in Carleton University's History and Theory of Architecture program. He specializes in the architecture of the Middle Ages and its revivals. He is the author of the book Newfoundland Gothic, as well as of numerous scholarly articles in Canadian and European periodicals and books. He has also written about buildings in several newspapers and magazines, and can usually be counted on to speak up when a controversial architectural issue arises in Ottawa. He has degrees from the University of Toronto, Toronto Metropolitan University, York University, and Queen's University. He's also an award-winning photographer, evidence of which I expect we will see tonight. In his spare time, Peter served 2 terms as president of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada and on the board of Heritage Ottawa. Peter's lecture has been pre-recorded, but he is here with us and has agreed to take some questions at the end of his presentation. Feel free to type your questions or comments in the Q&A dialog box at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to as many as possible afterwards. Our moderator for the Q&A session will be Heritage Ottawa board member Robert Pajot. Thank you, Rob, for moderating this evening's questions. And with that, I'm going to hand the evening over to Peter Coffman. Peter?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks also for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be back and doing something with Heritage Ottawa again. And most of all, thank you to everyone who's here. I can't see you, of course, but judging from the little number in the little box at the bottom of my screen, there are a fair number of you here, and that's really great to see, and I'm really grateful for your presence tonight. So, as you know, I'm going to talk to you tonight, or I'm going to show you a presentation on the ruins that Mackenzie King built at his Kingsmere estate in Gatineau, just across the river from here. And I've long been aware that he had done this, that he bought this country estate and that he'd assembled bits of demolished buildings and created this sort of pseudo ruins on his estate, and that they'd been left to the nation. But it wasn't until I actually started living in Ottawa 15 years ago that I finally got a chance, or got around to going to see them. And I was immediately fascinated by them. I was interested in them themselves and the way they looked and the way they were set up and so on. But I was also really intrigued by, in a way, their status, or the attitudes towards them, and especially how easily they're dismissed. A lot of people say, they're not, real ruins. It's not an actual building that fell down and this is the remains of it. They're just bits that he found and cobbled together to create these sort of pseudo ruins on his estate. So they're easily dismissed as, at best, a novelty act, or at worst, the product of a really sort of bent, perverse mind, and that was Mackenzie King's. So there's been there's been a certain amount of work done on the ruins and the gardens in particular. If you haven't read it and you're interested in this, I would really recommend Edwina von Baer's book, Garden of Dreams. But for me, specifically as a historian of the Gothic revival, I looked at these ruins and thought, oh yeah, I get those. These actually make complete sense to me immediately. I mean, they would be a less surprising thing had I seen them in say England in 1760 as opposed to Canada in 1935. But there's a continuous imaginative tradition there that I'm very familiar with because of the field I research. So I immediately thought, oh, I should do something with these. I should write something up, do something about them. And I thought, what a good idea. And of course, it went on the back burner for a good 10 years or so. And that idea of doing something with Mackenzie King's ruins and giving them that sort of historical context that I thought they would benefit from stayed on the back burner until I got an email not too long ago from a former student of mine, Mike Steinhauer, who's now the chief curator at the Senate of Canada. And Mike told me that he and a colleague of his at the University of Ottawa, Daniel Rook, were working on, or starting to work on, starting to gather material for a book of essays on Ottawa, one of the themes of which could be Ottawa ruins. And Mike said, would you be interested in doing something with this? And I decided to interpret ruins quite literally, and I thought, this is my big chance to do something with Mackenzie King's ruins. And then while I was still working on that, I heard from Catherine, who said, would you like to give a talk in our lecture series in the upcoming season? And I thought, well, yes, I'm actually working on an Ottawa topic, actually for the first time, in fact. So yes, I would like to give a talk on that. So what you're seeing tonight is a sneak preview of what will hopefully sometime later this year, maybe not until next year, be a chapter in a volume of essays that will come out on McGill Queen's University Press, but has been sort of percolating in my mind for over 10 years. So if you saw my last Heritage Ottawa talk, which was actually not on a completely unrelated topic and mentioned the ruins briefly, you'll know that I'm following the format I usually follow for these lectures now. I'm going to play a pre-recorded video, which I've already prepared for you, and I'll play it through, and then I will rejoin you at the end of it and take any questions you have and answer them as well as I can. So with that, I'm going to shut my camera off, mute myself, and hopefully share the correct screen this time. So I hope you enjoy the presentation, and I will see you in almost exactly 37 minutes. It catches you by surprise. You're hiking a trail in one of Canada's beautiful national parks. Then, all of a sudden, what is this? Well, it's hard to explain. It's a ruin, but a ruin of a building that never existed. It's an echo of the medieval past, but in a place that has no medieval past. It's like the decomposing corpse of some ancient civilization. And it reminds us of what will, eventually, become of us all. Welcome to the Abbey. And welcome to the world of William Lyon Mackenzie King, our longest serving and weirdest Prime Minister. To understand how King's ruins came to be, we have to unpack several layers of history. King built them on the grounds of his country estate, Kingsmere, in the mid-1930s. But his personal love of ruins began, as far as I can tell, way back in 1899. The ruins that inspired him dated from between about 2,000 and 500 years before that. The ideas that connect all these dots come mainly from the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm going to try to pull all those threads together and just maybe make some sense of these seemingly unaccountable and enigmatic ruins. For King, the road that would lead to the ruins of Kingsmere began in England. In the fall of 1899, He went there as a traveling fellow of Harvard University. He was just shy of his 25th birthday. This trip was a watershed in King's life. He was born, raised, educated, and grew to manhood as a subject of Queen Victoria. Inevitably, Britain, and even more broadly Europe, represented his cultural horizon, the distant point of origin of everything he understood as history and culture. He was primed to be impressed, and from the moment he arrived, England didn't disappoint him. On the evening of October 6th, his first full day in England, he arrived at the town of Kenilworth. If you've heard of Kenilworth, chances are it's because of Walter Scott's 1821 novel, Kenilworth. And if so, you'll know that its most famous feature is the glorious, ruined castle. The oldest part of the surviving castle is its Norman keep, which was built in the 1170s. The castle was added to by several later generations, most famously by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in the 1560s. It's Dudley's lordship over Kenilworth that is mythologized by Walter Scott in his novel, much of which is set at the castle itself. Like a lot of English castles, Kenilworth gradually fell into ruin after the Civil War in the 17th century, when a new generation brought different ideas and tastes to aristocratic lodgings. So, by the time King visited the place in 1899, it was already steeped in layers of history and reinvention. King's visit to the castle took place after breakfast on October 7th, 1899, as soon as the morning fog had lifted. His diary records his eagerness as he bought a guidebook and spent 2 hours wandering through the ruin. King was intensely interested in the history of England, but he surveys Kenilworth with the eye of the romantic, not the historian. He wrote in his diary,
"So much history and romance seen wrapped up in the place. One could imagine all of the gaiety, the past days of war and pleasure. And now all that remained were the walls and empty chambers. The rooks flew in and out of the tower windows, and the sheep were grazing in the courtyard. We went carefully over the whole of the castle, through the Norman keep, the old kitchens, and into the tower."
No place, he declared, had ever impressed him as much. He found the place ennobling. Soon, King was carrying a copy of Scott's Kenilworth with him around England. In the summer of 1900, King travelled from his English base to visit the continent. This gave him first-hand experience with the 2,000-year-old remains of ancient Rome. The trip made a lifelong impression on him. On June 25th, he visited the Colosseum, which he rated the greatest wonder of all. Like Kenilworth, the Colosseum transported King's imagination and caused him to reflect on time and mortality.
One could feel the past sweep before one, and the thought came to me often, what a waste is human life if man is not immortal. How full of folly and passion. How short and how absurd. As one looked too at the ruins of the Forum, one felt too that but for immortality, man's works were greater than man. It were as though whole cities and generations of men had spent their lives building only their own tombs and monuments, that an age greater than our own existed 2,000 years ago is recorded there.
Later the same day, he walked up Capitoline Hill, admiring both the view and the ruins.
The view of the Forum from this point was fine. After studying it out from above, we descended and spent an hour or two amid the ruins. I found them a real inspiration.
The following day, he climbed Palatine Hill.
This afternoon we spent amid the ruins of the Palatine Hill, a place of exceeding interest and inspiration. In fact, few places in the world impress me so much.
This visit seems to have consolidated King's intense emotional relationship with ruins. They stirred his historical imagination and caused him to reflect on the past, on mortality, and on the legacy of humanity. As he summarized in his diary,
"This has been one of the best days abroad, a day lived in the midst of the ruins of the past, a day which reminds man that art is long, though time is fleeting, a day to recall history and to evoke inspiration.
The ruins of Rome and England were a revelation to King. They made him see history, time, and humanity through new eyes. Except those eyes weren't new. In fact, they were really old. They belonged to the 18th century. In Mackenzie King's time, ruins already had two distinct histories. One was as architectural fragments of the past. The other was as a later age's imaginative recreation of the past. By the time King saw Kenilworth Castle, it wasn't just a medieval ruin. It was a carefully curated vision of the Middle Ages, frozen in time to speak to the sensibilities of a later era. The fascination with ruins was rooted in ideas, poetry, literature, and aesthetics of the 18th century. England was especially fertile ground for this sensibility. Not only did it have its fair share of secular ruins like Kenilworth Castle, but Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s covered the landscape with ruined religious buildings as well. Moreover, Henry's break with the Catholic Church had created a sense of ideological and psychological distance from the Middle Ages, making it easy to see the period as alien and exotic. The 18th century fascination with the mortal remains of medieval civilization resulted in new directions for architecture, landscape gardening, and even literature. Aesthetic theories of the picturesque and the sublime placed new value on qualities such as surprise, playfulness, ruggedness, awe, and even the aesthetic value of fear. One consequence was the invention of what's known as the folly, an ornamental building that had little or no function except to add picturesque or sublime qualities to a landscape. I want to look at one folly that's clearly a direct ancestor of King's ruins at Kingsmere. It's known as the Shobden Arches, and it's located in Herefordshire in the west of England. Like King's ruins, it's made from the fragments of actual buildings, or at least of one building. The arches also share the quality of notoriety that King's ruins would acquire. In fact, they greatly exceed King's ruins in this respect. That notoriety stems from the fact that the building from which the Shobden Arches were constructed, the medieval church of St. John the Evangelist, was a 12th century gem of a building that was deliberately demolished in 1752 so that pieces of it could be reassembled as an ornamental ruin. The Church of St. John the Evangelist in Shobden was built around 1136. It was adorned with one of the most important examples of what we call the Herefordshire school of Romanesque sculpture, a fantastically beautiful family of 12th century carving assumed to have been created by a connected group of artists. Today, the sculpture of the Herefordshire school is revered. In the 18th century, it wasn't. So in 1752, the landowner, Lord Bateman, decided that a new Gothic revival church would be nicer than the well-worn Romanesque building he had. The medieval church was duly demolished, and its fragments were reused to construct this folly ruin, 400 meters north of the church site. Follies like this are calculated to evoke an ancient but somewhat indeterminate history. The triple arch recalls the portals of monumental medieval buildings, but its ultimate roots are in Roman triumphal arches, such as the 4th century Arch of Constantine in Rome. But of course none of these models is reproduced at all precisely. The point isn't to imitate any particular monument, or even any particular era. The point is to evoke a romantic sense of the old, and let the viewer's imagination roam freely through the many deliberate gaps in the story. One of the things that moved through those gaps is ghost stories. The 18th century revival of interest in medieval architecture, both ruined and intact, is linked to a genre of literature that we still refer to by that architecture's name, Gothic. Horace Walpole, the aristocratic art collector and man of letters, gave us the first Gothic novel, the Castle of Otranto in 1764. At the same time, he was building himself one of the first Gothic Revival fantasy homes, Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, South London. The house was conceived by Walpole with a group of like-minded friends whom he referred to as the Committee of Taste. And one member of that committee was Lord Bateman, who had raised the Shobden Arches a decade earlier. Walpole's younger contemporary, William Beckford, also left us an early Gothic novel called Vathek. He would have left us an even more sublime Gothic architectural fantasy known as Fonthill Abbey, if not for its collapse in 1825. Both of these stories use the Middle Ages and its architecture as the setting for stories of the supernatural, dark powers, melancholy, and despair. They're at the foundation of a literary tradition that saw Gothic architecture as the ideal visual expression of our darkest, most irrational fears and impulses. So, did William Lyon Mackenzie King read The Castle of Otranto, or Vathek, or for that matter, any ghost stories at all? He records in his diary that he did once see a movie called The Ghost Goes West, and his entry suggests that he may have taken it a bit more seriously than its creator intended. But I found no evidence at all that he spent any time reading ghost stories. But then, he didn't need to. His imagination was already thoroughly immersed in this sensibility. To him, ghosts weren't exotic, titillating bogeymen conjured by artful writers. They weren't characters from fantastical fictions. They were part of his everyday life. Just how much King came to embrace the dead as companions wasn't fully known until well after he joined them. King's involvement in the occult apparently began in the 1920s, but wasn't common knowledge during his lifetime. Soon after his death, stories began emerging about his interest in communicating with the dead. But with the 1976 publication of historian C.P. Stacey's book, A Very Double Life, The Private World of Mackenzie King, King's reputation was transformed forever. His frequent seances, the certainty of his conviction that he lived among the spirits of the dead, his consultations with the deceased, ranging from Leonardo da Vinci to his own mother, his belief that the dead revealed his great destiny to him. All these facts are now embedded in the public perception of King. He's remembered as the longest-serving Prime Minister in Canadian history. He's also remembered as Weird Willie. To be clear, I'm not passing judgment on King's spiritual beliefs, even if my tone is a bit flippant. Nor do I blame a man born and raised during the reign of Queen Victoria for not having a more 21st century worldview. I'm just observing that his spiritualism and temperament were completely consonant with the sensibility that romanticized ruins in the 18th century and saw them as a portal to other, perhaps higher modes of consciousness. The Gothic imagination born in the 18th century had many heirs and successors. William Lyon Mackenzie King was one of them. Horace Walpole, William Beckford, and Lord Bateman were all still living when the picturesque garden folly appeared, fully formed, on the Canadian landscape. The evidence is still with us, overlooking the Bedford Basin on the edge of Halifax. This little building might be the least known important historic site in Canada. It was built under direct royal patronage. Prince Edward Augustus, later Duke of Kent and Strathearn, was the son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, and the brother to Kings George IV and William IV. His legacy was even more impressive than his lineage. He was the father of Queen Victoria. Edward arrived in Halifax in 1794 as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. He was 26 years old at the time, and his arrival was closely followed by that of his lover, Madame Julie de Saint-Laurent. Julie would never have been considered a suitable wife for the prince. For a start, she was already married. but the two seem to have lived together in pseudo-marital bliss until their final departure from Halifax in 1800. Edward left a substantial architectural mark on Halifax. Building projects he's connected with include the Prince of Wales Tower, St. George's Church, and most famously, the Halifax Town Clock on Citadel Hill. But the building we're concerned with was neither military, religious, nor civic. It was his personal residence, which came to be known as the Prince's Lodge. When Edward and Julie arrived in Halifax, there was no official residence considered suitable for royal occupation. So Governor John Wentworth and his wife Fanny offered the couple use of their new country estate. Where the Wentworths had built a cottage, Edward created a picturesque landscape garden complete with a classical villa. That villa is long gone, but illustrations of it show a two-story, flat-roofed building with elaborate classical features. The residence was part of a rolling, picturesque landscape garden with several smaller buildings depicted here in a picturesque watercolor by George Heriot, done around 1820. In the background of Heriot's painting, sitting on a mound at the edge of the property above the Bedford Basin, is the first folly conceived and built in what is now Canada. It became known as the music room because music was frequently performed around it. But the interior space isn't known to have served any specific function in Edward's day. The building's job seems to have been purely aesthetic, to serve as a visual focal point where the vista opens to the far side of the Bedford Basin, and as a platform from which to view the rest of the grounds. Historian Elizabeth Pacey has linked the music room to the small, circular temple follies at Kew Palace, which Edward would have known from his childhood. Of course, these miniature temples have their own architectural lineage as well, dating back to Bramante's 16th century Tempietto in Rome. But with Edward's folly, as with the Shobden Arches, the purpose is to evoke the past rather than imitate it. This little building, the villa and grounds around it, the carefully crafted topography, and even Heriot's painting of the place, collectively form a textbook exemplar of the picturesque landscape garden movement, at a point when it was near its peak in England, and just being introduced into Canada for the first time. Prince Edward's picturesque landscape didn't include a ruin, but ironically the villa itself fell into ruin after the prince left, and the Wentworths found little use for his aristocratic bauble. This sketch by Mrs. George Starr, done around 1850, shows a group picnicking on the grounds, with the decaying lodge used as a picturesque backdrop. The villa that had served as a royal residence had been reduced to a folly, but ironically the folly itself, the music room, never fell completely into ruin, and is the only building of the entire ensemble to survive today. It still stands atop its mound overlooking the basin, choked off from its former estate by the Bedford Highway and 2 sets of railway tracks. Devoid of any interpretive information and all but inaccessible despite its location on the edge of Atlantic Canada's biggest city, it might be the most ignored major historic site in the country. Did Mackenzie King know about this Canadian ancestor to his Kingsmere garden? I can't rule it out, but I haven't found any direct evidence that he did. Even if he did know about the music room from visits to Halifax, he's less likely to have been aware of the totality of the estate, Wentworth's villa, and its decline into ruin. The Prince's Lodge and Mackenzie King's Abbey are kindred spirits rather than cause and effect. But one can reasonably suppose that if King had known about the lodge, he would have seen it as significant, as a sign that his Abbey at Kingsmere was yet another way in which he was fulfilling his destiny. The parallels between the two projects are striking. King would probably have considered them uncanny. Both are manifestations of English picturesque sensibilities and design, transplanted to what is now Canada. Both are driven by the very highest level of patronage available. Given his pronounced sense of destiny, King would probably have seen the Prince's Lodge more as a foreshadowing than as a precedent. King was, though, aware that he was part of a larger movement, one to which his temperament was well suited. King wrote,
"All these are evidence of a something roundabout, which not only makes all things work together, but brings together all related things, a sort of magnetic something that attracts from the visible and invisible what is kindred to itself."
King dreamt of being a notable figure in the world of art and architecture. I mean that literally. On the morning of September 11th, 1937, he wrote in his diary,
"This morning I dreamt I was in New York or some other such center and was being honored by being made a member of some society of architects or fine arts."
As Prime Minister, King had long shown an interest in major architectural projects in Ottawa. Although he had a keen interest in such projects, he rued his lack of formal training.
Tonight after dinner I looked at newspapers and books about the sculpture of Athens. How I wish my education had been more thorough. I seem to have touched greatness at the fringes from many sides, but that is about all, just at the fringe.
When King wrote that, he had just agreed on a price for a bow window from a demolished house that he'd driven by in Ottawa. It was a bit expensive, but he figured that a thing of beauty was a joy forever, as he put it. He was determined to move that window to Kingsmere and re-erect it as a ruin. Up to that point, the romantic world of follies and ruins had been a sweeping historical drama that King had watched, enthralled, from the audience. With the acquisition of that window, King stepped onto the center of the stage. King's path to completion of his Kingsmere ruins zigged and zagged wildly. He bought the window for use as a ruin. Then he decided that the ruin would instead form part of a complete new building, which would be a blend of Westminster Abbey and the Parthenon. Good luck with that, says me, wearing my architectural historian's hat. King's lack of a thorough education shows through here. Anyway, he abandoned that plan and returned to the idea of a ruin, which he vacillated between calling the temple and the abbey. He dithered over the positioning of the artifacts and micromanaged the crew doing the work, which was headed by the accomplished architect J.A. Ewart. He took minute pains and agonized over every decision. The first ruin that comes into view for most visitors approaching from the modern-day parking lot is what King called the window on the forest. It sits on a mound between the main residential building and the forest views to the west. It frames the views of the forest and acts as a portal between the cultivated landscape in Moorside and what passed as the wilderness beyond. The window is perhaps the most enigmatic of King's ruins. It doesn't evoke any specific building type or any particular era in history. It just conjures a sense of indeterminate age, ephemerality, and the aestheticization and spiritualization of the landscape. The indeterminate quality of the monument leaves gaps that the imagination can fill at will, and this seems to have been just what King's imagination, and those of some of his friends, did. He records one such spiritual inward journey inspired by the window in his diary, after showing it to his friend Canon Bertel Heaney.
Canon Heaney was immensely taken with the window, which looks like a temple on a hill. The expression he used in reference to it was that there was a redemptive quality about it, that it seemed to redeem the whole landscape, give it a new meaning and significance. He spoke of it as being something in the nature of an object lesson to the people of Canada, and something which would stand for generations.
Within sight of the window is King's Arc de Triomphe, completed in 1936. Unlike the window, it has a very specific architectural lineage, ultimately to ancient Rome, but most immediately to the famous Arc de Triomphe at the end of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. King had a deep personal reverence for the Paris monument. On a visit in 1934, he wrote,
"When I came out of the opera, I said to the taxi driver Arc de Triomphe, as I stood there, I prayed earnestly to God to help me to triumph over all my faults and limitations. I prayed for power to help my own country, to help France and Europe and the British Empire, power to help mankind and to save it from further wars, power to help my fellow men.
King's Ark, of course, is not a purpose-built monument to his glory. It's a recycled doorway from the Bank of British North America in Ottawa, which was demolished in March of 1936. King heard about the demolition and ordered his contractor to get the columns of the door for Kingsmere. King's precise goals are sometimes a bit difficult to glean from his diary, but it's clear that he felt a strong sense of divine guidance and destiny as he contemplated the erection of his ark.
I am now experiencing what I did about this time a year ago, a marvelous evidence of a great divine guidance and purpose. I believe I will secure these columns and will be able to put them up at Kingsmere, a sign, a symbol as the ruin was, all evidence of the truth of what is being revealed to me.
King's Ark was completed on July 1st, 1936. He was immensely satisfied with the result, proclaiming its setting perfect and the whole a thing of great beauty. 3 days after its completion, he held a dinner party after which the women present drifted out onto the lawn.
When I saw them in front of the arch, I was in raptures. The beauty of the figures in their light garments next to the stone was like a Roman or a Grecian tableau. Sir George Purley was visibly dumbfounded with the beauty of the Arc de Triomphe.
A short walk from the window in the ark, secluded by trees and approached by a path that winds south from Moorside Cottage, was the climax of King's ensemble of ruins, the Abbey. Here, the original Daly Street bow window is combined with numerous other fragments, and with an almost bewildering array of very idiosyncratic symbolism, into a space that King clearly considered sacred. King settled on the name The Abbey in June of 1935. His rationale gives us some sense of the meaning the place had for him.
It is hard to know how to describe this particular spot. I am inclined, however, to refer to it as the Abbey, largely because of the little pictures of Melrose Abbey and of Tintern Abbey, which Father had in Oxford frames as an undergraduate at Toronto. The Abbey brings in the religious note as well as that of a place of residence. It speaks of an order of things which was prevalent in the Middle Ages and which gave a distinctive note to the life and architecture of Britain, as well as of Europe.
The combination of personal meaning and broader historical and cultural meaning encapsulates the vision that King gradually formed for the Abbey. His encounters with ruins in 1899 and 1900 are embodied here. Stones from his rebel grandfather's printing office form part of the wall. Near them is the coat of arms of the Speaker of the House of Commons in London, and carvings from Ottawa's original centre block of Parliament. English history, Canadian history, and King's history all converge at the Abbey, like a map of time, with an arrow telling King, "You are here." Unlike Horace Walpole and William Beckford, King never wrote a Gothic novel, and no one who's read from his diaries is likely to wish that he had. But he loved the romantic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, and readings of Gray's Elegy or the memoirs of Walter Scott or the poems of Matthew Arnold were frequent occurrences at the Abbey. And today, appropriately, ghost stories fill the place too, thanks to tours of the site given by the Haunted Walk of Ottawa. Here's a story told by one of their tour guides.
In early October, it was an incredibly foggy evening. A couple had booked a tour time earlier than mine. However, they became lost in the fog en route, so it was determined that they would join my tour. Once I finished, the gentleman very reluctantly asked if anyone had ever reported any strange experiences on the tours, to which I responded affirmatively. He then went on to describe that after I'd finished my story at the Abbey ruins, he distinctly heard, in his right ear, a male voice say, "Hello." He quickly spun around to see who it was, yet there was no one close by him at all. When he finished sharing that with me, his wife then said that as our group departed from the Abbey ruins, she turned, looked back, and could clearly see a silhouette of a male figure standing in the fog. Both were genuinely shocked, but fortunately neither was the least bit upset at these experiences that they had had. I have to say, I'm grateful to the kind spirit of William Lyon Mackenzie King for really knocking that couple's experience to another level during their tour. Despite getting lost and arriving late, the couple ended up taking home a very real experience from the haunted walk that they will not soon forget.
The Abbey and the whole of King's Ruins occupy a space of overlap of fact and fiction, of the spiritual and the material, of history and the present. King seriously considered being buried among his ruins. One evening in July of 1935, he was walking back from the Abbey with his friend Joan Pattison. He told her, "If I should die, I would be willing to be buried there." The following summer, they had a longer conversation about the idea.
I told her if I died, it was my wish to have my tomb placed on the summit, where the temple is. We then walked over to the Arc de Triomphe and spoke of placing the stones from Grandfather's printing office there. We spoke of what a spot it would be for a tomb.
By the time King died in 1950, though, the plan had changed. He decided instead to be buried in this surprisingly plain grave in Toronto's Mount Pleasant Cemetery beside his mother. To this day, the only graves at King's Abbey are those of his beloved dogs, all named Pat. The ruins King left us at Kingsmere are still every bit as evocative and mysterious as he would have wished. But I hope they seem a little less, weird to you now. A little less random, a little less unreasonable. I hope they look a bit less like a fake and more like a work of fiction. Ruins aren't just accidental leftovers from the past. We don't passively inherit them from the olden days. We choose them. We interpret them. We attach meaning to them. And sometimes we even create them from scratch. They point to the past, but they speak to and about us.
I am speaking to my own and other generations, expressing my soul, reconstructing the past with a truly spiritual note, and making meanwhile a sanctuary for one's own soul and the soul of others.
Wow. Thank you, Peter. I see that was amazing. That was really, really amazing. I don't think we've had such great production values on our talks, but thank you so much for making sense of that site. It's one that those of us that grew up here in Ottawa, I mean, my family has long history of going for picnics on that site, family members taking their wedding photographs on those ruins. So it's wonderful to see it in its context and the history of it and a better understanding of it. It does beg the question, are you familiar with other runes of that type in Canada? Are there other examples of something similar to that, or was those sensibilities of King at that time so different than everybody else? Or are there other examples? There, I think of later ones like the Guildwood in Toronto, which is completely different, but anything earlier that are similar to that?
I don't know of anything earlier. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't anything, but I haven't come across it. There may well be people in the audience who have. There are a lot of knowledgeable people in the Heritage Ottawa audience, so there may well be. And if
Yeah,
someone has some thoughts on that, I'd be really pleased to hear them. I don't
yeah.
know of early examples of purpose-built ruins. The other one that of course comes to mind is the Guild Inn, and that is a bit later. Yeah, it's I think what 20-25 years later, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look it up. But
Yeah, we'll open it up to the floor to see if anybody knows of any other ones across the country. And a reminder, everyone, to put your questions in the Q&A box. I see them coming in. There's lots of thank yous and congratulations I see in the box here. But so a reminder, just type up your questions or comments in the Q&A box. There is a question about, at one point you mentioned that King was there with the Deacon Heaney and his comment on the particular window, the first one element that he actually recreated, said that it's an object lesson to the people of Canada. Could you elaborate on that, or what you interpret was meant by that?
it's really hard to say. It's one of many, many examples where King's diary can be it can be very hard to interpret exactly what he's trying to say. King, at least in his diaries, at least the parts I've looked at, he has a couple of modes. One mode is, to put it bluntly, fairly pedantic, where he's just recording stuff that happened. His other mode, he sort of flicks into this sort of lofty mode. And when he flicks into lofty mode, he's certainly much less pedantic, but he can also be frustratingly obscure. So it's clear, though, that King somehow felt that his ruins did have a redemptive quality, that somehow, and he mentions in the quote I used at the very end, that he's doing this as a sanctuary for his soul and for the soul of others. Somehow he felt that the individual human souls experiencing this thing could somehow find comfort and in some way take steps towards redemption. And I think it's connected to, but what was by then an almost 200-year-old tradition, and this idea that ruins are one of the things I mentioned earlier in the video is ruins as a portal to some other and loftier form of consciousness. And I think that's what he's getting at. But the more King talks about that sort of lofty vision for his ruins, the harder to understand his writing actually gets. And that's one of the reasons I said, only somewhat tongue in cheek, that he never wrote a Gothic novel. And if you've ever read any of his diaries, you wouldn't really wish that he had. Because I can imagine if he had written a Gothic novel, it all would have been with the lofty switch flicked on. And it would have been pretty obscure and probably pretty pretentious.
And characters called Pat that are dogs, perhaps. A couple people are making the link and asking, is there a link that you know of to the rockeries in the Rockcliffe Park? Is there any relationship with a king, or were they an inspiration for the ruins? Do you know of any link between the two?
Not that I know of. Now, it could be if I or someone else went through King's diaries in a more with a more fine-tooth comb. It's possible that something could be there, but I'm not aware of any link. No.
Okay. Lots of stuff in the Q&A box here, and I will try to get to as many as I can. I'll sort of paraphrase some of these questions. A question: whether would you say that King was more of an opportunistic collector rather than an inspired architect? Is it more opportunity in how he collected that? Because a lot of those, he purchased a lot of those elements from buildings that were demolished in Ottawa, from, as you said, the bank and the residence.
And in one rather notorious case, he had them shipped from England after the House of Commons had been bombed. Had Lester Pearson, who was over there,
Okay.
procure some so they could be ultimately shipped for his use at Kingsmere. I mean, he was certainly opportunistic. I mean, unlike Lord Bateman in 1752 at Shobden, he didn't actually demolish anything in order to create ruins. So in that sense, he was entirely opportunistic rather. He would come across things and say, wouldn't mind one of those, and he'd figure out a way to get it and haggle on the price and that sort of thing. I don't think there's a dichotomy there, though. I don't think opportunistic rules out inspired. And I think the two are quite separate things that could coexist. I mean, you could say he was inspired. Inspired, of course, is a less quantifiable term, perhaps, than opportunistic. But he certainly had a vision for what he wanted to create there. And to that degree, you would still say he was inspired. But he collected the ruins in bits and pieces over several years whenever opportunity knocked.
Okay. There's tons of questions coming into the box, so I'm going to
That's good.
keep jumping. Yes, no, there's lots of questions, lots of comments and appreciative comments. Do you know why the Wentworth Villa fell into disrepair?
Because it was unused.
Just okay.
Yeah, once the prince moved out, there's this very elaborate complex which the governor had no use for, and it just fell into complete disuse. And of course, any building, especially a wooden building in a damp climate that falls into complete disuse, will just start to tumble down. I mean, you can go through small centers in Nova Scotia today and see examples of exactly that, wooden architecture that's fallen down with age and dampness.
And I guess, as you mentioned, that it then got cut off, the train tracks and roads that cut it off from the rest of the estate, so it's quite isolated. I did not know that.
Where most of the villa stood, the whole villa complex is now a rather nice, very charming, picturesque housing development. And then there's the Bedford Highway, and then there's these two train tracks, and then there's this mound of earth, and the music room, the sole survivor. The thing that was designed as a folly, but the one thing that didn't fall into ruin, and it's sitting there. There's no interpretive material. When I was there taking those photographs, Diane, my wife, and I were there, and this family came along walking their dogs past the music room, and they actually said to me, so what is this thing anyway? Now they're walking their dogs, so I assume they're from more or less nearby, but this is the least talked about, least known, and most utterly uninterpreted on site really important historic site in Canada, arguably. I mean, that's actually too broad a statement, but still, considering its age, it's late 18th century, its patronage, which is royal, father of Queen Victoria, it is kind of amazing that more people don't know about it, more people don't visit it, and it's kind of amazing that the infrastructure around it has made it almost impossible to visit.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to next time I'm in Hamilton trying to find that. That sounds really quite incredible. Another question, do you know if King had any connection with Conan Doyle? And just in terms of as a believer in other of the paranormal?
I don't know of any.
There's nothing in the diaries in reference?
I've never come across that. And of course, Conan Doyle was had a great interest in the paranormal and was a great believer in it. No, I haven't come across any reference. Again, perhaps a serious biographer of King would be the better person to ask that than me, because I'm just an architecture historian. And this was really, I mean, this wasn't really a biography of King. It was really more a biography of the ruins at Kingsmere. I mean, he did, of course, know John Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir, well, and Lord Tweedsmuir is well known he served as a Governor General of Canada during King's time as Prime Minister. Perhaps slightly less known, he also wrote ghost stories. So he's immersed with actually, and he also came from a family estate in Scotland where there was actually a pseudo-Roman temple built on the site as a folly. So he was connected with some people who were part of that tradition. I never came across a reference to Arthur Conan Doyle. But full disclosure, the only way you'll absolutely verify that sort of thing would be to go through all of King's diaries, and that's I mean, that's the work of many, 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 many years,
He was a
and it's
prolific.
not something.
Yeah.
Some people have done a lot more than I including Edwin von Baer, whom I mentioned earlier on. Uh, but I don't think an architectural historian is ever going to go through all of King's diaries because the time it would take, and frankly, the significant stretches of tedium would be just too hard to justify.
But in your readings of his diaries, and we know that there's a lot of his interest in the occult and the seances that took place on Laurier Avenue, on his house on Laurier, I believe. But is there any reference in his diaries to him having holding seances in the ruins? Like, did he
Not
ever use it for that kind of occult activity?
I never came across any reference of him holding him in the ruins. At Kingsmere, yes. In the cottage, yes.
Yeah.
Regularly,
But
frequently.
not.
But in the ruins, he tended to do things like go with his good friend Joan Pattison, who's briefly mentioned in the video, who's also his neighbor. They would go there together, and he would read romantic poets. He would read from Sir Walter Scott or Gray's Elegy, that sort of thing. He would go and read from the kind of literature that is associated with that sort of ruin. I never came across any reference that he actually held a séance there.
Okay, no, it's just interesting, a curious question that came up. Your use of the epithet Abbot, where does that come from? Or what was there, just because he referred to it as an abbey?
Yeah, because he referred to it as an abbey, and he's been referred to. People have written about him before, referred to him as the King of Kingsmere, which of course makes perfect sense. I specifically wanted to refer to him as the Abbot of Kingsmere, partly because he called the main sort of centerpiece ruin the Abbey, but also because of his reasons for calling it the Abbey, because he talked about the Abbey as evoking the Middle Ages, evoking a place of residence, as well as evoking a sacred place, a place of religion and worship. So the choice of the Abbey was very meaningful to him for specific ways. So I just thought it more appropriate to refer to him as the Abbot of Kingsmere rather than the King of Kingsmere.
Okay, well, and it perfectly fits. It perfectly fits. And one of the quotes that was so beautiful that you read as that he said is, "Art is long, time is fleeting."
Yes.
And time is fleeting. And on this presentation, Peter, thank you so much for this. This was so wonderful. And thank you everybody for your questions. There are a lot more. If you have other questions for Peter, please, you can send them to info@heritageottawa.org, and we will pass them along to Peter. I'd just like also to remind you, as we're wrapping up, the next Heritage Ottawa lecture next month on Wednesday, the 19th of February, is our annual Phillips Memorial Lecture, which will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Ontario Heritage Act with a panel discussion. So you can look on our website, and there'll be information on that, and how to register will be on the website. So thank you once again, Peter, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. We really loved it. As in you'll see you yourself can see in there, there's lots of thank yous and lots of comments on that. So thank you again, Peter. Now, one final note, Jen is going to put up on the web page here, or is going to put up on the screen. Heritage Ottawa lectures are provided free of charge. You're all here free of charge. We encourage you, if you're not already a member, to please join Heritage Ottawa, and to become a member and get advance warning on all these great lectures and our walking tours and a lot of other activities and our advocacy work, and to make a donation, because all of this is done for free, as you're well aware. So everything is on information on this is on our website, or you can scan the QR code, the fancy QR code that's on your screen right now. So once again, thank you to Peter. Thank you all of you for participating, for being here tonight, and we'll see you next month. Thank you and cheers.